Hi, I'm Borgie Home, and today we're going to ask the question, what's so great about Herod? And take a look at the Herodian Dynasty and their role in the New Testament. Throughout the New Testament, we see that the Herods and their cohorts play a lot of important supporting roles. Some have direct interactions with key New Testament figures, such as Jesus, John the Baptist, and Paul, and others are mentioned just briefly, but they still have influence on the events of their time. Their dynasty also built or is associated with many of the very important sites that we find in our New Testament stories. And whether they were mentioned directly or not, clearly the Herodian legacy affected the cultural and political climate of Israel during the life of Jesus and the beginning of the early church. Let's take a look at Herod the Great, the son of Antipater I. His mother was Cypris, a Nabatean noblewoman. His grandfather was Antipas, an Idumean who was converted to Judaism in 100 BC. He was made the governor of Galilee in 47 through 37 BC, and then made ethnarch, the king of the Jews, 37 BC until 4 AD. He was married to 10 women and had 14 children, at least. Herod was rejected by the Jews as a ruler. His ethnic background was not Jewish enough. Being Idumean and Nabatean, he had more Arab heritage, and his grandfather Antipas was a convert to Judaism. He was often seen as complicit with the Roman overlords, who were, of course, despised. And he also came to power when the defeat of the Hasmoneans was still fresh in the minds of the people. He's even depicted in the Talmud fictionally as a slave of the Hasmoneans, and also featured as a bloodthirsty, self-centered, foolish, lecherous, greedy man, and even a necrophiliac. The Jews really did not like Herod. One reason that people did consider Herod great in one respect is that he was an incredible builder. Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer, the leader of the Herodian excavations, called Herod a king who lived and breathed the art of construction, deeply understood its ways, and quite simply loved to build. This was reflected in his many incredible, lavish building projects. Let's take a look at just a few of these. One of the most well-known was the renovation to the temple and its expansion. This even required filling in a valley. He also built Caesarea with its incredible harbor. More about that later. And of course, he was known as the builder of the fortress and palace at Masada with its epic water system. He had a palace at Jerusalem he built, as well as other palaces throughout the empire. And of course, Herodium, which included his mausoleum. And this was built on an artificial mountain. One of the most consequential of Herod's building projects was the expansion and renovation of the temple at Jerusalem. Now, this was a bid to curry favor with the Jewish leaders. They were often deeply offended by Herod's Hellenistic tendencies, and they doubted that he was a full Jew. Begun in 19 BC, the temple project took approximately 80 years to complete, with 60 of those taking place after Herod's death. Josephus writes that Herod acquired 1,000 wagons that were to bring stones for the building and chose 10,000 of the most skillful workmen and bought 1,000 sacerdotal garments for as many of the Levitical priests and had some of them taught the arts of stone cutters and others of carpenters and then began to build. We see here that Herod had legitimate Levitical priests doing the building because others were not allowed to enter the temple space. And so the priests had to be the ones doing some of the work. A fable in the Talmud shows how Herod was so disfavored among the Jews that they pondered deeply and wondered why on earth Herod had received the blessing of being the one to rebuild the temple. Herod's new temple was covered with gold. Josephus claimed that the temple doors were a massive 49 feet by 24.5 feet. And while this sounds outlandish, there were such ancient doors that were this enormous in the Roman world. He expanded the Temple Mount on 3 sides, to the north, the west, and the south. He doubled the mount's original size by adding 15-foot retaining walls, some of which still stand today, the best known of which is the western wall, pictured on this slide. This also required the filling of a deep valley, but the Bezetha Valley, and he added a tower in each corner of the complex. Solomon's porch was one of the few features of the original temple that was left unmodified. The most fortified feature was the Antonia fortress in the northern wall. This was built to protect the temple against attacks coming from the north and to guard it in times of strife. In addition, a large reservoir with cisterns that filled it, known as the Pool of Israel, provided water security for the Temple Mount. Herod also built the port city of Caesarea, naming it after Caesar Augustus, his benefactor. It benefited from fertile soil from its location in the western plains of Sharon, and produced many cereals and grains for trade throughout the Roman Empire, and this funded Herod's many legendary building projects. This became a home base for many New Testament rulers of Judea, such as Pilate, Felix, and Festus, as well as Herod the Great. But it was also the birthplace of the great revolt of the Jewish people against Rome. And in after 70 AD, it was made a Roman colony. It was a chief regional city from that point on for centuries and controlled trade from Rome to its eastern holdings. It was also a main hub on the international Silk Road between the western and eastern nations of the known world. So Caesarea was a very powerful and influential city. It's also prominent in the book of Acts in the New Testament. We see in Acts that Philip the evangelist preaches the gospel there. This is also the site where Gentiles first received the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Cornelius's house, and the place where Paul was under house arrest at the palace for 2 years. Herod also built a theater at Caesarea, the first Roman theater to be built in Israel. It seated 4,000 people and featured the incredible acoustics that were typical of these innovative Roman theaters. Because of this, it's still in use even today for concerts, and it's also the location where the Pilate stone was discovered, a stone that bears the name of Pontius Pilate. Caesarea also had a large hippodrome, Josephus calls it an amphitheater, which is a term for a place of sport, and said that it was also the most famous and popular entertainment venue in the region. Vespasian later converted it to a prison and used it as a place of imprisonment and execution for many Jewish rebels after the revolt. And one of the most incredible engineering feats undertaken by Herod the Great was the harbor at Caesarea. It is the largest artificial port on Earth and utilized pozzolana, which is a hydraulic mortar made up of imported volcanic ash, which is capable of hardening underwater. This ash came from Pompeii. It had two large breakwaters that extended 200 to 300 feet out from the shore, and according to Josephus, this port could allow 100 ships to dock safely at Caesarea. This is even more than the leading port of Athens. Port taxes from this harbor went to Rome, and profits padded Herod's pockets, providing more money for his immense building projects. Here we can see 3 photos showing some remnants of the palace at Caesarea. Unfortunately, much of it has been washed away at this time, but when originally built, it was a beautiful structure overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It was built atop a 330-foot cliff, and it was 2 stories and featured an Olympic-size freshwater pool, as well as lavish, expansive gardens, an open-air dining room and porch. Archaeological excavations also found lots of imported wares and sundries from all over the Roman Empire, attesting to Herod's great wealth and his decadent lifestyle. This palace was inherited by Archelaus until 6 AD, when Rome gave it to the new prefect of Judea. It was returned to King Agrippa I until his death, when it again reverted to Roman ownership. One of the most famous sites Herod built was the mountain fortress of Masada, overlooking the Dead Sea. This fell into the hands of Jewish rebels in 66 AD and became the site of a famous months-long siege by the Romans in 71 to 73 AD. At this time, nearly 1,000 Jewish rebels, when realizing the siege would be successful, took their lives in order to avoid capture by the Romans. This noble act became a symbol for modern Zionism and the current Jewish state of Israel. The palace at Masada was a 3-tiered palace, built to look as if it hung off the sides of the mountain. Masada also had an incredible system of cisterns and an aqueduct. Water would stream down the surrounding mountains, falling into tunnels, which led to these cisterns. The cisterns could be accessed from inside of the fortress, and so this gave water security to the fortress at all times. If full, the cisterns could hold a decade's worth of water, and this allowed the fortress to be a habitable settlement despite being in a region with only 0 to 4 inches of rain a year. The Masada bathhouse was another lavishly decorated and ingenious site built by Herod. As you can see in the photos, it included beautiful colors, which were very rare for the ancient world, as well as a wonderful water heating system allowing steam to escape into surrounding rooms. Very luxuriant. The Jerusalem palace, built by Herod, was possibly the place where Pilate questioned and condemned Jesus before his crucifixion. It was the residence of the Roman governor, according to Josephus and Philo, and in Mark 15, verse 16, part A, we learn that the palace was also called the Praetorium. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that this palace was constructed with exceedingly large, high rooms decorated in very costly fashion with gold, stones, and color washes. The executive director of the Holy Land Studies Center, Mark Turnage, says, Pilate pronounced his judgment on Jesus at a place in Greek called lithostratos in John 19, verse 13. This Greek term refers to a paved floor with colorful tiles known as opus sectile. Within the land of Israel, this style of floor within first century buildings appear primarily in those of Herod the Great, which indicates Pilate condemned Jesus in Herod's palace. Herodium is the mausoleum for Herod and his wives. It was built in a plain where he defeated his Hasmonean and Parthian enemies in 40 BC. It's a 30-acre fortress and was situated on an artificial mound which he constructed. It featured 4 large towers, an enormous pool large enough to even accommodate sailing lessons, and had its own island which featured a colonnaded structure. The pool complex area with bathhouse was a massive 210 by 135 feet, the largest discovered from the Herodian era, and was surrounded by a garden. Within the Herodium, they also discovered a 650-seat theater with a box seat for dignitaries. This was reminiscent of the grand imperial theaters. It was decorated with elaborate murals featuring exotic scenes from around the Roman Empire, such as the Nile River and Italian landscapes. The frescoes were of such fine quality that historians believe Herod may have borrowed these artists from Caesar Augustus himself. Now let's get back to Herod's dysfunctional family as we meet a few of its members. Take a moment to look at this family tree, which will help you to keep all of the Herods and their cohorts straight. As you can see, and as you will learn, it's a family filled with intrigue, affairs, and assassinations. Herod divorced his first wife, Doris, to take a royal bride, Mariamne I, of the Hasmonean royal line. This marriage was merely an attempt to legitimize his standing with the Jewish people, although some say Herod was wildly in love with Mariamne. She lived from 54 to 27 BC until being executed by her husband Herod after his sister, the devious Salome I, poisoned his mind with jealousy. Herod also fathered several very unfortunate sons. Augustus said, "I would rather be of Herod's swine than of his sons." His firstborn, Antipater I, was from Herod's first wife, Doris of Jerusalem. However, Doris and Antipater were banished when he divorced her to marry Mariamne I. After Mariamne's death, they were later recalled to Herod. However, finally, he was accused of plotting against Herod and was executed in 4 BC. He may have got what was coming to him because he was behind the execution of his half-brothers, the sons of Mariamne I, Alexander and Aristobulus, who were executed in 7 BC. Because of fear, they would try to usurp the throne as well. And some of these fears were planted in Herod's head by none other than Antipater. Herod had other atrocities besides these. According to Josephus, some Pharisees prophesied to his brother Pheroras and his wife, saying, by God's decree, Herod's throne will be taken from him, both from himself and his descendants, and the royal powers were to fall to her and Pheroras and to any children they might have. In response, Herod decides to kill all the Pharisees involved, as well as any of his family members who responded positively to the prophecy. He also kills his wife Miriam's relatives, her brother who was a high priest, her mother, and even her grandfather. Let's take a look at our first meeting with Herod 1 in the Bible. This takes place in Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12, where he visits the Magi. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream by God not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. The story continues in Matthew 2, verse 13 through 15, with a warning. Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken of by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. This brings us to one of the most notorious episodes in Herod's life, known as the slaughter of the innocents. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted, because they were no more. Perhaps it was because of this heinous crime that Herod suffered such a terrible death. He had an affliction so terrible it had its own nickname and was dubbed Herod's evil. Modern researchers trying to discover what was wrong with Herod suspect chronic kidney disease complicated by a very uncomfortable case of maggot-infested gangrene of the genitals. Dr. Jan Hirschman says the symptoms listed in ancient records included intense itching, breathlessness, convulsions in every limb, and gangrene of the genitals. He tried to commit suicide to escape this suffering, but his cousin prevented him. He died in Jericho, which he often used as a winter retreat. Herod knew that he would not be mourned by many, and so he gave an order that upon his death, many popular and prominent leaders should be executed, so that displays of grief would accompany his demise. Fortunately, it seems that this order was ignored. But upon his death, some Jews in Judea do revolt, and Quintilius Varus, the Roman legate of Syria, crucifies 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem as retribution for the revolt. Herod's burial. Josephus describes his funeral procession. Herod was borne upon a golden bier, studded with precious stones of various kinds, and with a cover of purple over it. The dead man, too, was wrapped in purple robes and wore a diadem on which a gold crown had been placed, and beside his right hand lay his scepter. Thousands must have been in the procession, including the whole army, as if marching to war, followed by 500 servants carrying spices. And they went 8 stades, or 200 furlongs, toward Herodium, for it was there that the burial took place by his own orders. His burial site at Herodium was discovered in 2007. His sarcophagus, which was made of red limestone and was the most elaborate of 3 found at the site, was found empty and was the most thoroughly destroyed of the 3. The Jerusalem Museum gives this description. 3 stone sarcophagi were discovered in fragments, 2 light-colored and 1 reddish, on display here. The reddish sarcophagus was decorated in an opulent but restrained fashion with rosettes and palmettos. It was found smashed into hundreds of pieces scattered about the area. We assume, even though Herod's name does not appear on it, this sarcophagus held the king's body. Probably it was destroyed by Jews seeking their revenge. Jesus' family is able to return to Israel after Herod's death. Let's pick up our story in Matthew 2, verse 19 through 23. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the mother and the child, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Herod's territory upon his death was divided among 3 of his most prominent sons, Philip, Archelaus, and Antipas. However, these 3 all want all of the power and wealth and authority for themselves, like their father had, so they squabble. Herod Archelaus was the tetrarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. He builds his capital, naming it pretty much after himself, Archelaus, known for splendid date groves, but he imitates his father's cruelty to the point that he rules only briefly from 4 through 6 AD because the Jews appeal to Rome and have him removed from power. He is replaced by various Roman governors, including Pontius Pilate. And recall that Mary and Joseph avoided his territory of Judah and instead took Jesus to Nazareth in Galilee, apparently preferring the other brother over the cruel Archelaus. Herod Philip becomes tetrarch of the northern territories from 4 through 34 AD and establishes his capital of Caesarea Philippi at the site formerly known as Banias or Panias. This city had a long, troubling pagan history, with the ancient Canaanites building a sanctuary to Baal there. In the Old Testament, this site is referred to as Baal-gad in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon in Joshua 11:17 and Mount Baal Hermon in Judges 3:3, confirming this place was intimately associated with Baal worship. Later, the Greeks and Romans worshipped the fawn god Pan there in a cave with an impressive, seemingly everlasting spring. Philip eventually marries Salome, his grandniece. Ew. And Josephus also reports he built up the village of Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee and gave it the status of a polis. Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea from 4 through 39. He builds his capital of Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee near important trade routes. However, Josephus explains that his capital was poorly planned and situated, built over an old cemetery, and this rendered all who entered it ritually unclean in the eyes of the Jews, and so many avoid this area. Antipas had to bring forcefully some of the new inhabitants. Here he also had a gilded palace with figures of living creatures, and this violation of Jewish law resulted in the building's later destruction. This place may have been the site of his birthday banquet related to John the Baptist's demise. Herod Antipas was the second husband of Herodias, and Jesus didn't have a lot of good things to say about him. He called him a fox. Now, in Jewish usage, this could allude to not only a cunning or shrewd or sly person, but it also meant he was a third-rate, unimpressive ruler. Rulers were supposed to be lions, but Herod Antipas was just a fox. And among the sons, there was apparently another Philip, presumably not a ruler, who was the first husband of Herodias and father of Salome by her. Herodias was the granddaughter of Herod the Great, through the line of his wife Mariamne, one whom he had killed. She leaves her first husband, Philip, to marry Herod Antipas, his brother. Josephus records that she and Herod Antipas divorced their spouses and married each other because they were already committing adultery and sought to legitimize this illicit affair. Salome is the daughter of Herodias by Herod Philip, the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great through his line with wife Mariamne I. She eventually marries Philip the Tetrarch, her great-uncle. This situation with these characters figure heavily in John the Baptist's imprisonment. Let's pick up this story in Matthew 14, verse 3 through 7. For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Although Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Having been prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and then they reported to Jesus. John the Baptist dies this unjust death because of the bitterness of one adulterous woman and her easily led daughter. Herod Antipas feels bound to do this grisly act because of his promises in front of his guests. Jesus also was before Herod Antipas as part of the time leading up to his crucifixion. We are told that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas because he was from Galilee, and Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and this made Jesus under his jurisdiction. He had been wanting to meet Jesus, we are told, but he also feared Jesus was John the Baptist, resurrected after he had had him killed. And much to Herod Antipas's shock, Jesus remains silent when he questions him. He returns Jesus to Pilate after mocking him. Herod Agrippa I is Herod the Great's grandson, who ruled in 37 to 43 AD, and he was also a persecutor of God's people who harassed the early church. Unfortunately, his persecutions don't just stop with harassment. In Acts 12, 1 through 3, we read, "Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Herod Agrippa I won't get away with the things he has done. Let's pick the story back up in Acts 12, verse 20 through 23. Now he, Herod Agrippa I, was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. Josephus tells a parallel story of this day, adding that Herod Agrippa's clothing was wholly of silver, and it illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays. It was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. Whatever the reason for the crowd's enthusiastic admiration, God was not pleased with his acceptance of this worship. The angel of the Lord struck him, apparently with an awful disease, probably including worms or parasites, and that's the end of Herod Agrippa I. But there's good news for the people of God. Acts 12:24 reassures us, but the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. Now this brings us to the next level of Herod's line, his great-grandchildren. The first of these is Drusilla. She is widowed twice and then leaves her third husband to marry Antonius Felix, a Roman procurator of Judah. Felix is Paul's first judge at Caesarea around 57 AD, and Paul witnesses there to her and Felix. Felix leaves Paul in prison for 2 years at Caesarea until he is brought before Drusilla's brother, King Herod Agrippa II. Another great-granddaughter of Herod on the scene is Bernice. She was rumored to have had an incestuous relationship with her brother Herod Agrippa II, and she also hears Paul's defense at Caesarea along with her brother. King Herod Agrippa II, the great-grandson of the Herod the Great, ruled from 50 through 93. Paul was brought before him and examined at Caesarea, and Paul preaches the gospel to him along with Festus, Bernice, and others. He orders that Paul could have gone free had he not appealed to Caesar. So what can we learn? What can we take away from this review of the Herodian Dynasty and their role in the New Testament and the lives of God's people? First, we can see that God's plans will prevail. Evil cannot stop God's salvific plan. Although there is evil woven throughout Herod's family line, Herod the Great couldn't kill Jesus and stop God's means of salvation. Through divine intervention, Mary and Joseph are warned in a dream by God and they flee to Egypt. Herod Agrippa I couldn't kill Peter, the leading apostle of the early church. Again, there's divine intervention, and an angel opens a prison door and leads Peter out to freedom. When it looks like evil is getting the upper hand, remember, no matter what, God is still working out his divine purposes. Scripture tells us in Ephesians 1:11, our God is the one who works all things after the counsel of his will. A second lesson we can learn from the story of this dynasty is that no matter what, the gospel will go forth. Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea by Felix and Herod Agrippa II didn't stop the gospel from going forth. By divine providence, Herod the Great's great-granddaughters, Bernice and Drusilla, and his great-grandson, Herod Agrippa II, get to hear the gospel from Paul. Remember Paul's words in 2 Timothy 2, verse 8 and 9. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel, for which I am suffering, even to the point of being chained like a criminal. But God's word is not chained. Lastly, when we hear the story of this evil dynasty, we can remember that no matter what, heaven is assured. Herodias, Salome, and Herod Antipas killed John the Baptist, and Herod Agrippa I killed James, but they could not stop their heavenly reward. Remember the great Scottish minister Samuel Rutherford's words, "Whatever happens, the worst will only be a weary traveler receiving a joyful and heavenly welcome home." Thank you for listening to this presentation, and here are sources of all of the very smart people I encountered in my research to bring you this information.